You wake to the sound of water moving through stone, a gentle whisper that has accompanied your sleep since childhood. Threading through the darkness before dawn touches the carved faces of Baon. The air hangs thick with moisture and the green breath of jungle that presses against the city's edges. While somewhere in the distance, a night heron calls across the vast reservoirs that mirror starlight like scattered jewels. This is the hour when Angkor breathes most deeply, when the great stones release the heat they have gathered through another day of tropical sun, and when the water that courses through every channel and canal speaks in voices only the sleeping city can fully understand. You rise from your mat and step into air that carries the scent of frangipani and wet earth, moving through rooms where shadows pool like dark water between the carved pillars your grandfather's hands helped shape. Outside, the network of channels that brings life to your quarter murmurs with its eternal flow, carrying water from the Great Beret through smaller canals that divide and subdivide like the veins of some immense creature, delivering sustenance to gardens and households, workshops and temples, in a rhythm so constant it has become part of your heartbeat. The engineers who designed this system understood something profound about the marriage of stone and water, creating not merely a city, but a living organism that drinks from the monsoon and exhales prosperity through 1,000 hidden arteries. In the pre-dawn dimness, you make your way along pathways worn smooth by generations of feet, passing beneath Naga balustrades, whose serpent forms seem to undulate in the uncertain light, their stone eyes watching over the flow of water that sustains all life within these walls. The great reservoirs stretch beyond sight, their surfaces broken by the gentle wake of boats already moving toward the floating markets, while herons stand motionless among the lotus stems, their patience matching that of the stone apsaras who dance eternally upon temple walls. This water is more than mere liquid. It is the blood of the kingdom, the visible manifestation of divine favor that allows 1,000,000 souls to flourish where jungle should reign supreme. Your work begins before the sun climbs above the tree line, tending to the small garden plot that feeds your family and contributes its surplus to the great web of commerce that connects every household to the royal granaries. The earth yields readily to your tools, made fertile by the careful management of flooding and drainage that transforms what should be impenetrable wilderness into paddies that stretch toward every horizon. Rice grows here in abundance unknown to northern kingdoms, while fruit trees bend low with mangoes and jackfruit, and fish multiply in channels where they can be harvested like crops. The abundance feels as permanent as the carved stone faces of Avalokiteshvara that gaze down from temple towers, expressions of serene compassion suggesting that such prosperity represents the natural order of a world blessed by gods and governed by kings who understand their divine responsibilities. Water flows not merely around buildings, but through them, under them, integrating stone construction with liquid infrastructure in ways that seem to defy the usual opposition between human artifice and natural process. Temple moats reflect sanctuary towers with perfect clarity, while palace channels carry both practical drainage and symbolic meaning, connecting earthly governance to cosmic principles through the language of engineered flow. The builders of this place understood water as more than utility. They grasped its role in maintaining not merely physical life, but spiritual harmony, creating a city where every drop serves multiple purposes in an intricate dance between necessity and beauty. As morning light strengthens, the city reveals its full magnificence in the interplay of architecture and hydrology that makes Angkor unique among the capitals of the earth. The morning markets pulse with activity organized around the rhythm of water transport, boats arriving with goods from distant provinces, while vendors arrange their wares in patterns that mirror the orderly flow of the canals themselves. You move among stalls where fish still glisten with river water, where vegetables carry the dark earth of regularly flooded fields, where pottery shaped from clay dug from reservoir banks holds drinking water that tastes of minerals drawn from deep stone. Everything connects to everything else through the medium of managed water, creating a prosperity so reliable it seems guaranteed by the structure of reality itself. Children play in shallow channels designed for their safety, their laughter mixing with the sound of water moving toward its countless destinations throughout the city. Merchants call their prices across narrow waterways, while boats loaded with rice and silk navigate channels that serve simultaneously as transportation arteries and architectural features, their movement creating gentle wakes that lap against temple steps and palace foundations. By midday, the heat builds toward its daily crescendo, but the water system provides relief through the constant evaporation that cools courtyards and creates microclimates where people can work and rest in comfort. You pause in shade cast by temple walls, feeling the coolness that rises from nearby channels, watching the dance of light reflected from moving water onto ancient carvings that seem to shimmer with life. The stones themselves participate in this cooling through their thermal mass and careful orientation, but it is water that makes human habitation possible on this scale. The afternoon heat settles over Angkor like a heavy blanket, yet the city's inhabitants move through their daily rhythms with the confidence of people who inhabit a world designed for their flourishing. You watch water engineers inspect the great sluices that control flow between reservoirs, their movements precise and unhurried, checking mechanisms that have functioned flawlessly for generations beyond memory. These men possess knowledge passed down through bloodlines of builders, understanding the subtle relationships between water pressure and stone architecture that allows temples to rise from artificial lakes without undermining their foundations. The temple complex of Angkor Wat rises from its rectangular moat like a mountain emerging from primordial waters, its 5 central towers reflecting perfectly in still surfaces that double its height and create the illusion of a structure that extends infinitely both upward and downward. Pilgrims arrive by boat to approach the sanctuary across stone causeways that seem to float upon the water's surface, their prayers mixing with the gentle sound of wavelets against carved balustrades where Nagas and Garudas maintain their eternal vigil. In workshops throughout the city, artisans shape objects that celebrate this marriage of water and stone. Bronze vessels that echo the curves of temple pools, silk textiles that capture the shimmer of sunlight on flowing water, wooden sculptures that seem to flow like liquid despite their solid material. The aesthetic of Angkor has grown from the fundamental experience of abundance sustained by hydraulic mastery, creating a visual language where even the hardest stone appears to move with fluid grace. Yet, as evening approaches, the first subtle signs of something shifting in the patterns you have known all your life begin to manifest. Changes so minor they barely register as conscious observation, yet create an underlying sense of discontinuity that troubles you without clear cause. The rain that usually arrives with predictable timing seems to hesitate this year, gathering in clouds that form and disperse without releasing their burden, while the water levels in local channels appear slightly lower than your memory suggests they should be at this season. These variations remain well within normal parameters, the kind of annual fluctuation that always occurs, yet something in their quality feels different, as if the great system that sustains Angkor has developed an almost imperceptible irregularity in its normally perfect rhythm. You notice that conversations in the markets occasionally turn to weather patterns, farmers mentioning that certain signs they watch for seasonal guidance seem offset by days or weeks from their traditional timing. The shrine keepers speak of offerings made to ensure proper rainfall, rituals that have always been performed, but now carry a subtle urgency that was absent in previous years. Water engineers examine channel flows with more attention than usual, making minor adjustments to gates and spillways, maintaining their confident expertise while displaying a heightened awareness that suggests some underlying concern they cannot yet articulate. These are not alarm signals, but rather the quiet stirring of attention toward details that normally require no conscious thought, like the way you might notice your own heartbeat only when its rhythm varies slightly from perfect regularity. Evening brings relief from the day's heat, and the return of water sounds that grow more prominent as human activity subsides. The gentle splash of boats returning to harbors, the whisper of irrigation channels carrying their burden toward distant fields, the deep murmur of the great reservoirs that hold tomorrow's sustenance in their dark embrace. You sit in your courtyard, listening to these familiar voices while watching stars emerge above temple silhouettes, feeling the solid permanence of stone beneath your feet and the liquid reliability of water flowing past your threshold. The city settles into night with the satisfaction of systems functioning as they always have. Millions of lives sustained by engineering marvels that seem as eternal as the carved mountains they emulate. Temple bells ring across the water to mark the passing hours, their bronze voices carrying farther in the humid air, while night-blooming jasmine releases its perfume to mingle with the scent of wet earth and flowing water that defines the very essence of this place. Yet somewhere beneath this contentment, a question stirs like sediment disturbed in still water, formless and wordless but persistent enough to color your dreams with images of channels running shallow, of rain clouds that promise but do not deliver, of the vast network of stone and water that supports your world, requiring something it has always received but might not always possess in the abundance that makes Angkor possible. The question has no answer yet, perhaps no answer at all, but it moves through your consciousness like water seeking its own level, finding the spaces where certainty has worn thin and settling there to wait. The rains arrive 3 weeks late this year, and when they finally come, they fall in patterns that seem to have forgotten their ancient rhythm. You stand in your courtyard, watching water drum against leaves that have grown brittle, waiting for relief, while the channels that should be rushing with renewed life accept this delayed gift with a sluggish gratitude that troubles you more than the drought itself had done. The monsoon, when it finally breaks, delivers its moisture in sudden torrents, followed by days of surprising clarity, as if the sky cannot decide whether to give or withhold the blessing that has sustained Angkor since the first stones were laid. Water levels in the great reservoirs rise, but not to the heights your father described from his youth, and not with the steady inevitability that once marked the transition between dry season and wet. You notice that the water engineers spend longer hours at their posts, adjusting flows with more frequency and precision than was needed in previous years. Their confident expertise now shadowed by something that might be called concern if it were acknowledged openly. The channels still carry their burden throughout the city, but their voice has changed, speaking in hesitant whispers where they once sang with certainty. In the markets, conversations that once turned to weather as comfortable ritual now carry an edge of genuine attention. Rice farmers from distant villages mention yields that require more careful management than their grandfathers ever needed, while fishermen speak of catching their quotas but working longer hours to do so. These are not complaints, but rather acknowledgments that the old ease has been replaced by something requiring more conscious effort, more deliberate attention to details that once managed themselves. Dawn finds you joining the crews that gather each morning to maintain the intricate network of channels and reservoirs that keep Angkor functioning. Work that has always been necessary, but now demands greater intensity and more frequent intervention. The silt accumulates faster than it once did, requiring constant removal, while the water gates need adjustment with a precision that tests even the most experienced engineers. You wade into channels that should run clear, but carry sediment that clouds their flow. Using tools passed down through generations to preserve systems whose complexity becomes more apparent as they require more conscious tending. The palace has increased the number of workers assigned to hydraulic maintenance, drawing men from other crafts to ensure that water continues to reach every quarter of the city without interruption. You work alongside stone carvers and silk weavers who have set aside their specialized trades to clear channels and repair spillways, their skilled hands learning the different art of moving water rather than shaping matter into beauty. There is honor in this work, dignity in preserving the systems that sustain a million lives, yet also an acknowledgement that paradise requires more effort to maintain than it once did. The great reservoirs that seemed bottomless in your youth now reveal their edges more clearly during the dry months, while the smaller channels that distribute water throughout residential quarters occasionally run so low that households must adjust their daily routines to accommodate reduced flow. These adjustments become part of the new normal, accepted with the same grace that previous generations had accepted abundance. Yet they mark a shift from the effortless prosperity that had defined Angkor's golden age toward something requiring more conscious participation in its preservation. The markets still overflow with goods brought by water from across the kingdom. Yet something has shifted in their rhythm and atmosphere that speaks of a more careful management of resources that once seemed inexhaustible. You move among stalls where vendors display their wares with the same skill and pride as always. But conversations have grown quieter, more attentive to the subtle fluctuations in supply that previous generations had never needed to notice. Rice remains abundant, but is measured more precisely, while fish vendors speak of journeying farther to fill their boats with the catch that local waters once provided without such effort. The floating markets that have long been Angkor's pride continue their ancient dance across the reservoir surfaces, yet their movements seem somehow more deliberate. Their courses planned with greater attention to water levels that no longer maintain perfect predictability throughout the seasons. Children still play in the shallow channels designed for their safety, but their mothers watch these water levels with eyes that have learned to judge depth and flow with precision their own mothers had never needed to develop. Artisans continue to create objects of beauty that celebrate Angkor's mastery over water and stone, yet their workshops now operate with economies of scale that waste less material and plan production cycles around resource availability that was once assumed to be constant. The aesthetic sensibility that emerged from abundance now adapts to accommodate a more mindful relationship with the materials that sustain both art and life, creating works that honor both beauty and conservation in ways that previous generations had never needed to consider. As evening prayer time approaches, you notice that the temples draw larger crowds than they had in seasons past, their courtyards filling with citizens whose devotion has deepened rather than wavered in response to the subtle challenges that test Angkor's hydraulic foundation. The rituals that ensure proper rainfall and adequate flooding have grown more elaborate, incorporating additional offerings and extended ceremonies that demonstrate the people's commitment to maintaining harmony between human needs and divine favor that governs the natural forces upon which their civilization depends. Priests speak with increased frequency about the importance of spiritual discipline and collective virtue in maintaining the cosmic balance that sustains earthly prosperity. Their sermons emphasizing themes of gratitude and perseverance that resonate with congregations who have learned to value resources that once seemed unlimited. The bronze bells that mark prayer hours ring with special urgency during ceremonies dedicated to water spirits and agricultural deities, their voices carrying across reservoirs that reflect temple towers with slightly less depth than they once had, but no less beauty or spiritual significance. The king has commissioned additional temples and expanded existing sacred complexes. These new constructions, serving both as expressions of continued prosperity and as investments in the spiritual capital that ensures divine protection over the hydraulic systems that sustain his realm. Artisans work with renewed dedication on sculptures and reliefs that depict the eternal dance between gods and mortals. Water and stone, temporary abundance and permanent faith that transcends any fluctuation in material circumstances. You return to your courtyard as darkness settles over the city, listening to the water sounds that have changed in ways you are only beginning to acknowledge even to yourself. The gentle murmur of flowing channels carries new overtones, irregularities that speak of systems working harder to maintain the flow that once seemed effortless. Somewhere in the distance, you can hear the splash of workers laboring through the night to clear a blocked spillway, their voices mixing with the natural sounds of water, finding its way through stone and earth toward its countless destinations. The great reservoirs that once breathed with deep, regular rhythm now seem to hold their breath more often, their surfaces reflecting starlight from slightly lower levels that require the eye to adjust its expectations of what constitutes normal depth. Night-blooming flowers still release their perfume into humid air, but the moisture itself carries subtle differences, the result of water that has worked harder to reach this place and may work harder still to continue its journey toward the sustenance of gardens and households throughout the sleeping city. The question that had stirred in your consciousness during the earlier season has not found answers, but it has settled into a more comfortable uncertainty, the kind of uncertainty that acknowledges change without demanding immediate resolution. You sit listening to these altered water voices, feeling the solid stone beneath you and the flowing liquid beside you, knowing that both will continue their ancient partnership, but understanding that this partnership now requires more conscious attention and deliberate care than the previous generations who built this paradise had ever imagined would be necessary. You wake each morning now to sounds that speak of struggle rather than harmony, the splash and scrape of workers already laboring in channels that refuse to maintain their proper flow without constant human intervention. The water that once moved through Angkor's arteries with the confidence of natural law now requires persuasion, correction, and endless adjustment to continue its journey from reservoir to household, from temple to garden, from the great sources that sustain life to the countless destinations that depend upon its arrival. What had been the effortless circulation of abundance has become a daily negotiation between human will and liquid reluctance, a conversation conducted in the language of sluice gates and spillways, of diverted channels and reinforced embankments that must be spoken fluently by every soul who hopes to see another season of prosperity. The engineers who once supervised water flow with the calm authority of men whose knowledge aligned perfectly with natural forces now work with the desperate precision of physicians attending a patient whose condition requires constant monitoring and frequent intervention. You join the crews that gather before dawn to assess overnight changes in water levels, to clear obstructions that appear with increasing regularity, to repair erosion that undermines channels with persistence that suggests the very earth has grown tired of supporting the hydraulic miracle that transformed wilderness into civilization. Each morning brings new evidence that the system which had seemed as permanent as stone now demands more attention than the most delicate temple carving, more care than the most precious silk, more constant vigilance than the protection of royal treasure. The great reservoirs that had appeared bottomless in your youth now reveal their limitations with stark clarity during the dry months, their edges emerging from receding waters like the bones of some vast creature whose flesh has been consumed by invisible hunger. The channels that distribute this hoarded water throughout the city carry their burden with visible effort, flowing sluggishly through passages that once rushed with eager abundance, their reduced volume requiring careful allocation that leaves no household unaware of how precious each drop has become. Water no longer flows. It must be guided, coaxed, and sometimes forced through systems that seem to have forgotten their original purpose, requiring human memory to compensate for what natural momentum once provided without conscious thought. Your days now begin before the first light touches the temple towers and continue long after darkness has claimed the reservoirs, each hour filled with work that had never needed doing when the water systems functioned according to their original design. You wade through channels clogged with sediment that accumulates faster than seasonal flooding can clear it away, using tools that had once served for routine maintenance, but now provide the only means of keeping water moving toward destinations that cannot survive without its arrival. The silt seems to gather with purposeful malice, blocking spillways and fouling filters with persistence that demands constant vigilance from workers whose other crafts and trades have been abandoned in favor of the more urgent task of preserving the hydraulic foundation upon which all other activities depend. The palace has conscripted artisans whose hands had shaped bronze and stone into beauty, redirecting their skills toward the less glorious but more essential work of maintaining the channels and reservoirs that keep Angkor alive. Silk weavers whose fingers had created patterns of incredible delicacy now spend their days clearing debris from water gates, while sculptors whose vision had given form to divine beauty learn to judge the subtle gradients that determine whether water will flow or stagnate in the intricate network of passages that connect every quarter of the city. There is no shame in this labor, for everyone understands that without water, there can be no silk, no sculpture, no civilization worthy of divine protection. Yet the transition from creating beauty to preventing disaster marks a fundamental shift in how human energy must be deployed to maintain what previous generations had taken for granted. The work crews that gather each morning grow larger as more households contribute family members to the essential task of hydraulic maintenance. Young men and women learning skills their grandparents had never needed because the systems had maintained themselves through the natural abundance that blessed Angkor's early centuries. You work alongside neighbors whose previous conversations had centered on market prices and temple festivals, but who now discuss water pressure and channel depth with the expertise of professional engineers, their knowledge acquired through necessity rather than formal training. The community has adapted to these new demands with characteristic resilience, yet the adaptation itself represents acknowledgement that the old ease has been replaced by something requiring constant attention and collective effort to sustain. The temple construction that continues throughout Angkor has taken on new urgency as both expression of faith and practical response to hydraulic challenges that test the engineering wisdom of the kingdom's greatest builders. You watch massive stones being positioned with precision that must account not only for aesthetic and spiritual considerations, but also for the water management requirements that have become integral to every architectural decision. New temples incorporate more sophisticated drainage systems, their foundations designed to channel water with efficiency that earlier structures had achieved through the natural abundance that no longer flows with such reliable generosity. The marriage of stone and water that had once seemed effortless now requires careful planning and constant maintenance to preserve the harmony between built environment and hydraulic infrastructure. The palace complex undergoes continuous modification as engineers adapt existing structures to accommodate water flows that behave differently than the original designers had anticipated. Their calculations based on abundance that has proven less permanent than the stone itself. You observe workers installing additional spillways and reinforcing embankments that protect royal buildings from flooding that had never threatened previous generations. Their labor guided by knowledge that has evolved from the original hydraulic principles to encompass contingencies that the master builders had not considered necessary. The modifications maintain architectural beauty while serving practical functions that have become essential for preserving structures that were designed to last forever, but now require adaptive engineering to survive changed conditions. Royal workshops produce bronze fittings and stone channels designed to improve water control throughout the city. Their artisans applying traditional craftsmanship to new purposes that serve the essential function of hydraulic management, rather than purely decorative or ceremonial objectives. The aesthetic that emerges from this practical necessity maintains the visual harmony that defines Angkor's architectural identity, while incorporating elements that acknowledge the reality of water systems requiring more conscious management than their creators had anticipated. Beauty and function merge in solutions that honor both artistic tradition and engineering necessity, creating works that celebrate human adaptation to changing circumstances rather than lamenting the loss of conditions that had made such adaptation unnecessary. The temples that anchor Angkor's spiritual life have become centers not only of worship, but also of community organization around the practical challenges that test the kingdom's hydraulic foundation. Their courtyards, serving as gathering places where citizens coordinate the labor necessary to maintain water systems that no longer maintain themselves. You attend ceremonies that blend traditional devotion with prayers specifically addressing the water spirits, whose favor has become more difficult to secure. Their rituals incorporating offerings that acknowledge both gratitude for continued sustenance and concern about future reliability. The religious calendar now includes additional observances dedicated to hydraulic deities. Their festivals timed to coincide with seasonal transitions that require especially careful management of water resources whose behavior has grown less predictable despite increased human attention. Priests speak with growing frequency about the spiritual discipline required to maintain cosmic harmony during periods when natural forces seem less aligned with human needs. Their sermons emphasizing themes of perseverance and collective responsibility that resonate with congregations whose daily experience involves constant vigilance over water systems that demand more from human effort while providing less in return. The theological framework that explains Angkor's prosperity has expanded to encompass concepts of divine testing and spiritual purification through adversity, interpretations that maintain faith in ultimate divine protection while acknowledging temporary challenges that require enhanced human participation in preserving the blessings that sustain civilized life. Temple construction projects have incorporated water management elements that serve both practical and symbolic functions. Their reservoirs and channels, designed to demonstrate continued mastery over hydraulic challenges while providing backup systems that supplement the main network during periods of reduced flow. The integration of religious and engineering purposes creates structures that honor both divine authority and human ingenuity, celebrating the partnership between heavenly favor and earthly expertise that enables Angkor to maintain its position as the greatest city of the age, despite obstacles that would have defeated less sophisticated civilizations. Faith and technology unite in solutions that preserve both spiritual confidence and material prosperity through conscious effort rather than natural abundance. The resources that Angkor devotes to maintaining its hydraulic systems now exceed what entire provinces once contributed to temple construction and royal ceremonials. Yet this expenditure has become necessary to preserve the foundation upon which all other activities depend. You see entire neighborhoods organized around water maintenance schedules that determine when households can draw their daily supplies, when artisans can operate workshops requiring significant water use, when temple ceremonies can include ritual ablutions that had once been performed without consideration of resource limitations. The careful allocation that governs every aspect of water distribution requires administrative sophistication that rivals the management of royal treasuries. Yet this complexity serves the fundamental purpose of ensuring that Angkor continues to function despite hydraulic challenges that test the limits of human engineering and organizational capacity. Trade relationships with distant provinces now emphasize exchanges that support water management rather than purely luxury goods. Merchants bringing specialized tools and materials needed for channel maintenance, while taking Angkor's products to markets that value quality over quantity in recognition of production constraints imposed by hydraulic limitations. The economic foundation that supports the kingdom's prosperity has adapted to accommodate reduced margins and increased costs associated with maintaining systems that once generated surplus without requiring such intensive human investment. Commerce continues to flow through Angkor's markets, but its rhythms reflect the new reality of abundance that must be consciously preserved rather than simply enjoyed. Households throughout the city have modified their daily routines to accommodate water availability that requires more careful timing and conservation than previous generations had practiced. Yet these adaptations maintain the essential patterns of civilized life, while acknowledging resource constraints that demand more thoughtful consumption. Children learn water conservation practices as naturally as they once learned to expect unlimited access. Their education encompassing both traditional knowledge and practical skills that prepare them for life in a city that has adapted to changed circumstances without abandoning its commitment to remaining the greatest urban center of the known world. Darkness no longer brings rest to Angkor's hydraulic systems or to the people whose labor maintains their function. The night hours filled with maintenance work that cannot wait for dawn and monitoring activities that ensure water continues flowing toward households and temples that depend upon its arrival regardless of the hour. You move through channels illuminated by torches carried by workers who repair erosion damage that daylight revealed, their voices mixing with the sounds of water that no longer flows with natural confidence, but must be guided through passages that require constant attention to prevent blockages that could interrupt supply to entire districts. The palace has instituted night shifts for water management personnel, whose expertise has become too valuable to limit to daylight hours. Their knowledge essential for responding to problems that develop when reduced flow reveals weaknesses in systems that had remained hidden during periods of greater abundance. Temple bells mark not only prayer times, but also work schedules that coordinate hydraulic maintenance across the city, their bronze voices carrying information about water levels and flow rates to communities whose survival depends upon understanding conditions that change more rapidly than seasonal rhythms had taught them to expect. The great reservoirs reflect starlight from surfaces that workers patrol throughout the night, their boats carrying tools and materials needed for repairs that cannot be postponed until morning, without risking interruption of water supply that serves essential functions in every quarter of the city. Night-blooming flowers still release their perfume into humid air, but the moisture they draw from carries the scent of human effort rather than natural abundance, the result of water that has been guided and managed through systems that require constant vigilance to maintain their function. You listen to these sounds of nocturnal labor while feeling the solid stone beneath you, and understanding that both stone and water now depend upon human consciousness for their continued partnership in sustaining the civilization that your ancestors built upon the foundation of seemingly inexhaustible natural abundance. The question that had stirred in your consciousness seasons ago has evolved into acceptance of responsibility that extends through every hour of every day, the kind of responsibility that acknowledges change while maintaining commitment to preserving what can be preserved through conscious effort and collective determination, to continue inhabiting the greatest city that human ingenuity has ever created in partnership with forces that require more careful attention than they once demanded, but continue to provide the foundation for civilized life whose beauty and complexity justify whatever effort their maintenance requires. The channels still carry water through Angkor's heart, but their voice has grown thin, speaking in whispers where they once sang with fullness that matched the confidence of the people who shaped their courses through stone and earth. You wake each morning to sounds that echo differently in spaces that have grown more hollow, the absence of certain familiar voices creating a silence that spreads like slow ripples across the surface of daily life. The water arrives where it is needed most, reaching temples and palace complexes through the dedication of workers whose numbers have diminished, yet whose commitment remains absolute. Their labor maintaining essential flows while accepting that abundance has become a memory rather than an expectation. Households throughout the city adapt their routines to accommodate reduced availability without abandoning the practices that define civilized existence. Their inhabitants displaying the same ingenuity that built Angkor by finding ways to preserve beauty and meaning within constraints that earlier generations had never imagined would become necessary. Gardens bloom with flowers that require less water, their careful arrangement creating compositions that honor aesthetic principles while acknowledging practical limitations. Artisans continue their crafts using techniques that waste nothing, their creations maintaining the quality that has made Angkor famous throughout the known world, while demonstrating mastery over materials that must be used with precision rather than abundance. The great reservoirs reflect sky from surfaces that reveal more of their stone-lined edges than they once had, yet they continue to serve their essential function of storing and distributing the water that sustains temple rituals and household needs through careful management that allocates every drop according to priorities that maintain the most crucial aspects of urban life. Night brings the sound of workers maintaining channels that carry this precious resource through passages that require more attention than their original designers had anticipated, their labor ensuring that Angkor continues to function despite hydraulic challenges that have transformed effortless abundance into conscious conservation requiring constant vigilance and adaptive engineering solutions. You notice that certain workshops stand empty during hours when they once bustled with activity, their artisans having departed for opportunities in distant provinces where water flows with something closer to the reliability that Angkor once provided without question. These departures happen quietly, without announcements or farewells that might disturb the confidence of those who remain. Families simply closing doors and covering windows before beginning journeys toward places where their skills might support households without the constant uncertainty that has become part of daily existence in a city whose hydraulic foundation requires more effort than many are willing or able to provide indefinitely. The markets continue to operate with dignity and efficiency despite reduced volume, vendors arranging their goods with the same care and pride that characterized Angkor's commercial life during its most prosperous periods. Yet conversations carry different rhythms now, more thoughtful pauses between words as people consider choices that previous generations had made without conscious deliberation. Trade boats arrive less frequently, their captains reporting conditions throughout the kingdom that make certain routes less profitable than they once were. Yet the goods that do reach Angkor's floating markets maintain the quality that has sustained the city's reputation for excellence in commerce and craftsmanship across distances that span multiple kingdoms and diverse cultures. Children play in channels that still flow with sufficient depth for safety, yet require more careful supervision than their parents had needed at the same age. Their laughter mixing with sounds of water that moves more slowly, but continues to provide the foundation for games and exploration that connect new generations to the hydraulic heritage that defines Angkor's unique character among the cities of the world. Some families choose to relocate to areas where educational opportunities align better with reduced expectations, while others remain committed to preserving traditions that have deep roots in soil that has supported civilization for centuries, despite recent challenges that test but do not break the fundamental bonds between people and place. Temple complexes maintain their spiritual vitality through the devotion of communities whose numbers have stabilized around core populations, whose commitment to preserving sacred traditions transcends concerns about material abundance or hydraulic reliability. Their prayers rising from courtyards that echo more than they once did, yet continue to provide space for ceremonies that connect earthly existence to divine purpose. The priests who serve these temples adapt their rituals to accommodate reduced water availability, while maintaining the essential elements that ensure proper veneration of deities whose favor has sustained Angkor through both prosperous and challenging periods. Their theological understanding, encompassing both gratitude for continued blessing and acceptance of conditions that require more human participation in preserving sacred traditions. Palace buildings stand with undiminished architectural magnificence despite housing fewer administrative personnel, their stone chambers designed to endure far beyond the political structures they served, while maintaining beauty that speaks of eternal principles rather than temporary circumstances. Royal workshops continue producing objects of exceptional quality for reduced but still discriminating markets. Their artisans working with materials that demand careful use while creating pieces that uphold standards that have made Angkor's products sought throughout the civilized world for their combination of technical excellence and aesthetic sophistication that transcends mere luxury to achieve artistic significance. Water still flows through the ancient channels that connect palace to temple to marketplace, yet its voice carries different meanings now, speaking of endurance rather than abundance, of survival rather than expansion, of careful stewardship rather than inexhaustible prosperity. The system functions according to principles that honor both original engineering wisdom and adaptive modifications that enable continued operation despite changed conditions, creating hybrid solutions that preserve essential functions while acknowledging that perfection has given way to adequacy maintained through conscious effort and collective dedication to sustaining what can be sustained of the civilization that previous generations built upon foundations that seemed as permanent as the stone itself. The great temple towers continue their eternal conversation with sky and water, their carved surfaces reflecting light from reservoirs that still mirror their magnificence despite reduced depth, creating visual harmonies that transcend hydraulic limitations to express spiritual truths that remain constant regardless of material circumstances, affecting the human communities that gather in their shadows to participate in worship, that connects individual existence to cosmic order operating according to principles that encompass both change and continuity within divine plan, that honors both prosperity and adversity as necessary elements in the spiritual development that justifies earthly existence. You sit in your courtyard, listening to sounds that have grown softer over seasons, whose passage you measure more by changes in the quality of silence than by the arrival and departure of familiar voices. The water that flows past your threshold, speaking in cadences that require closer attention to understand, yet continue to provide companionship for thoughts that have learned to value persistence over abundance. The channels still carry their ancient burden through Angkor's heart, yet their murmur has acquired the character of conversation between old friends who no longer need to speak loudly to communicate understanding that transcends immediate circumstances, to encompass deeper harmonies between human purpose and natural forces that operate according to principles encompassing both limitation and possibility within cosmic design that honors endurance as much as achievement. Night brings stillness that settles over temple complexes where smaller communities maintain rituals that preserve connections to traditions spanning centuries of continuous worship. Their devotions rising from courtyards that amplify prayer through acoustic properties designed for larger congregations, yet equally effective for intimate ceremonies that focus spiritual attention with intensity that compensates for reduced numbers through enhanced individual commitment to preserving sacred knowledge. Stars reflect from reservoir surfaces that reveal more stone than they once did, yet continue to provide mirror for celestial magnificence that connects earthly architecture to divine geometry operating beyond human understanding, while remaining accessible through careful observation and contemplative practice that finds meaning in both fullness and emptiness as expressions of cosmic truth. Temple bells ring across water that carries their bronze voices through humid air toward households where families gather around smaller fires, yet maintain customs that honor ancestors whose wisdom encompasses both prosperity and adaptation. Their conversations blending practical concerns about daily necessities with philosophical reflections on persistence and change that characterize human existence within temporal sequences that test individual resolve, while offering opportunities for spiritual development through circumstances that challenge comfortable assumptions about security and permanence. The bells speak to fewer ears than they once addressed, yet reach souls whose attention has been refined through experience that teaches appreciation for continuation rather than expansion, for preservation rather than accumulation, for depth rather than breadth in relationships between consciousness and environment. Dawn arrives with light that illuminates stone surfaces carved with images of eternal dance between gods and mortals, their forms unchanged despite weathering that gradually softens details while preserving essential gestures that communicate truths about divine grace and human responsibility that remain relevant regardless of material circumstances, affecting the communities that gather to contemplate their meaning. Water continues moving through channels that connect sacred and secular spaces according to engineering principles that honor both practical necessity and symbolic significance, creating flows that sustain life while expressing understanding about cosmic order that encompasses both abundance and scarcity as temporary conditions within eternal patterns that exceed human comprehension, yet invite participation through conscious attention to relationships between individual existence and universal purpose. You remain seated as morning advances, feeling the solid stone beneath you and listening to liquid voices that speak of endurance rather than promise, of presence rather than possibility, of connection to place that transcends concern about abundance, to encompass appreciation for continuation itself as gift worthy of gratitude and careful stewardship. Through whatever seasons may come to test the bonds between consciousness and environment that define human existence within landscapes, whose beauty persists regardless of the number of souls who gather to witness their daily transformation through light and shadow, water and stone, sound and silence merging in compositions that honor both permanence and change as necessary elements in cosmic symphony that continues beyond individual capacity to follow its complete development, yet remains accessible through attention to present moment, where temple towers rise toward sky that encompasses both known and unknown territories within divine architecture that includes Angkor as one note in eternal music, whose continuation requires no human audience, yet benefits from conscious appreciation offered by those who choose to listen with care. Sufficient for recognizing beauty that persists whether observed or ignored, celebrated or forgotten, inhabited or left to commune with forces that preceded human settlement, and will continue their ancient conversations long after the last footstep has faded from pathways worn smooth by generations, whose presence enriched but did not create the deeper harmonies that connect water to stone across temporal distances measured in geological rather than human scales.